There's an opening cutscene I've never been able to get out of my head. This fixation started before I had ever played the game. I was too young when it came out. The game had startlingly violent scenes for the time. I didn't have any experience with the genre. I didn't even own the console. But sometime in the mid-aughts, while aimlessly wandering through the early uploads of YouTube gaming videos, I saw the opening cutscene for Parasite Eve, and I've never been able to forget it. There are two things that are immediately striking about the scene. One is the particular moment in FMV technology. Parasite Eve was made by Square and released in 1998, only a year after their megaton hit Final Fantasy VII. Like Final Fantasy VII, Parasite Eve starts out with this elaborate pre-rendered fly-through of a city. In Final Fantasy, this opening scene was a crucial piece of narrative and technological place setting. As the camera flew through Midgar, we learned that this game will take place in a setting unlike any other Final Fantasy. And we simultaneously learned that the perspective has radically shifted. It now offers a full 3D world to explore and lose oneself in. In many ways, Parasite Eve's intro is performing the same stunt, introducing us to the world of the RPG, the immersive 3D landscape now possible on the power of the PS1. But where Final Fantasy VII opened by introducing us to Aerith, a soon-to-be iconic symbol of gaming, Parasite Eve starts with a different kind of icon. The second striking thing about this scene is the location, that this elaborate CGI production is not situated in a spaceship or a castle, but set in the present day, the very moment the game was released into. Christmas, 1997. The United States, New York City. There's a particular buzz that happens in my brain when I see this. It feels like the beautiful limited fidelity of late 90s CGI at the time, the absolute cutting edge of technology, has now transformed into the perfect vessel for historical nostalgia. That this is what memory looks like. The lights a little too dramatic, the shadows too extreme. The city sounds bustling but feels almost empty. The wintry sky fades into a gray haze. A weeping Statue of Liberty is perfectly framed alongside the Twin Towers. I watched this opening scene again and again, entranced by the tech, the music, the uncanniness of it all. But it wasn't until this year that I made the jump into the past, that I sat down and actually played the damn thing. And I am delighted to report that the feeling, the buzz of its depiction of New York persists well into the game. Parasite Eve is, in fact, a work of adaptation. The story comes from a novel of the same name, published just 3 years earlier by Hideaki Senna. In the book, as in the game, a threat to humanity arises within our own biology. Mitochondria, those dastardly powerhouses of the cells, begin to act independently of their hosts. It is pop sci-fi, a real level of scientific knowledge, the writer has a PhD in pharmacology, exaggerated to absurd levels. In the book, the mitochondria's rebellion can cause humans to spontaneously combust. In the game, this is expanded to all sorts of genetic mutations, demonstrated in genuinely excellent body horror sequences. But the book is fairly nondescript in its location, taking place in universities and hospitals somewhere in Japan. The New York setting, the interplay of the game's story with some of the city's most famous landmarks, that's all original to the game. There's a lot of the city to love here. The first sequence of the game takes place in Carnegie Hall. You interrogate a scientist in the Museum of Natural History. You crash in an apartment in Soho. Each of these locales are realized with the warm fuzziness of fixed camera pre-rendered backgrounds, which means that while the locations may be a little blurry on modern screens, they're also rich with detail, graffiti and clutter and museum welcome desks and signs in Chinatown. They're all connected, too, with one of the best map screens I've ever seen in a game, an entire recreation of Manhattan rendered in full 3D, flattened into a single plane, except for the blocky skyscrapers climbing out of it. Selecting different locations to travel to will swing the map around, letting you catch glimpses of the Brooklyn Bridge, the Statue of Liberty, or the other boroughs. The Twin Towers are here too, though in this version of Manhattan, the Chrysler Building, an optional super dungeon within the game, stands as tall as everything else. Almost as entrancing as the map screen are the traveling interstitials, where Aya and her team discuss their next move while driving from place to place. The city whips by in endless brownstone canyons, reflections sparkling off the cruiser's windshield. But my favorite place in Parasite Eve is its version of Central Park. You arrive there at night. The park is empty completely. We're told that a huge crowd has gathered at the Delacorte Theater towards the top of Central Park. We also learn that a number of animals have escaped from the zoo on the other end of the park, either of which could explain the emptiness. But the feeling of this space is not abandoned. It is, a term that would come into popularity decades after the game's release, intensely liminal. The crunching of the snow, the small circles of illumination from each street lamp, the lack of a clear direction to head towards. Each of these screens is one that you simply pass through, accompanied, of course, by Yoko Shimomura's incredible score. The question that all Parasite Eve's bombast wraps itself around is that of domination. Are humans meant to be the supreme form of life on Earth? Were we meant to exercise complete control over our environment, or are we meant just as a stepping stone for something else? In this case, mitochondria. To this end, it's hard to think of a more effective setting for the story than Manhattan, an island completely transformed by its occupation of humanity. At its most evocative, what Parasite Eve finds is how cold that constructed world would be without its animating figures. Because of its technical limitations, because of the specific point in time it was made, it paints a perfect portrait of what would remain without us. This feeling is so specific to its point in time that it's kind of a miracle we got it at all. An early 3D game set in a realistic version of Y2K New York, specifically based in the cold loneliness of winter. A few years earlier, this version of the city would have been impossible to render. A few years later, the city itself would be a fundamentally different place. And as a matter of fact, we didn't get a game like that. We got two. Max Payne, released on July 25th, 2001 by Remedy Entertainment, was, at the time, a technical marvel. PC Gamer said the texture work had to be seen to be believed. Greg Kasavin, yes, the one from Supergiant, wrote for GameSpot that no game to date has featured such sharp, starkly realistic detail in its environments. Today, the visuals of Max Payne 1 are most frequently remembered for the grimacing face of its protagonist, but if you boot up that original game again and take one step onto the New York City streets, oh wow, there's still some magic here. Max Payne, unlike Parasite Eve, does not take place on Christmas. But you get the sense that even if it did, there would be no wreaths or string lights hung up in the neighborhoods Max is blasting through. And also, unlike Parasite Eve, Max Payne has no attachment to the real geography of New York. The version of the city that Max exists in is a snowy, dystopic version of the Bronx, eerily quiet and uncluttered streets rendered almost grayscale in the winter gloom. Narratively, it's a rendition of New York pulled from hard-boiled noir novels, exclusively populated by gangsters and addicts, backstabbing cops and femme fatales, but its emptiness implies something else, a sort of conjured nightmare version of the city, made for the specific purpose of tormenting Max. Throughout the story, Max is forced to relive the night his family was killed in trippy PTSD flashback levels, explicit nightmares for the player and character to overcome. But the entire city has a dreamy nightmare logic to it. The snow, the slow motion, the photos of real faces wrapped onto polygonal bodies. There's a scene I love early on in which a mobster car crashes into a tanker truck and the truck keels over. Watch this scene again. These are the only two vehicles on the road. Their collision feels staged, theatrical, everything happening solely for the benefit or inconvenience of the protagonist. Later, Max fights through a snowy shipyard, metal containers stacked so high on either side of him that they almost exactly resemble the blocky streets of the Bronx he was in hours earlier, the same sets with a new coat of paint. Impressively for the time, the game has a number of seamless transitions between building interiors and the city streets. Max will shoot out a window in a building and find himself on a fire escape or tiptoe across theater rooftops. One of these settings, Max standing next to a giant glowing hotel sign, is so iconic it's more or less replicated in Max Payne 3. But what I'm always struck by most here is the sky. In 2026, my version of Max Payne plays at a resolution astronomically higher than it was designed for, and the sky is a static patchwork, an uneasy jumble of grays and reds and blues, never meant to be viewed in this fidelity. It's claustrophobic, almost, the ceiling of the world visible with all its imperfections. Or, as Max might say,
I was in a computer game. Funny as hell, it was the most horrible thing I could think of.
Max Payne was released on PC in July of 2001. The console port came 5 months later, in December. Between those two dates, New York changed. The original Max Payne features the Twin Towers frequently, in its opening cutscene, in its skybox, and its beautifully illustrated loading and comic screens. But like Zoolander, Men in Black 2, and Lilo and Stitch, the Skyline was hurriedly altered in the weeks after 9/11. On the Xbox and PS2, Max still blasts his way through the Bronx, still has nightmares of his life before, still ends the game on top of a skyscraper facing off against an army of cops. But the city, in the background, is different. There have been many other games set in New York since Max Payne and Parasite Eve, of course. Culturally, Insomniac's Spider-Man games may have created the best-known version of the digital Big Apple, a city of spires and glass and perpetual golden hours. The quite good standalone expansion, Miles Morales, is even set in winter, each windowsill of the city dusted with snow. But for pedestrian, street-level detail, it's hard to think of any game more devoted to the task of icy recreation than Ubisoft's 2016 title, The Division. The Division was an early example of the always-online RPG shooter, and to that end, its narrative is mostly designed to allow the player to have endless gun battles through the streets of Manhattan. After a bioweapon causes the city to fall into chaos, the government activates a collection of sleeper cell agents named the Division, who are definitely the good guys and can be trusted with total power over life and death. It is not a deep or interesting story. I first noticed the Division at the same time I imagine a lot of people did, during its 2013 E3 demo when a guy on screen shuts the door of a car, low-key the coolest thing any of us had ever seen. When the game first released, it was caught in the 2010s Ubisoft spin cycle. Does this look enough like the demo? Were gamers misled? Blah blah blah. Returning to The Division in 2026 is a fascinating experience. The game is indeed a mid-teens Ubisoft title. The UI is comically overstated. There are a number of different bases across the map you're meant to unlock. When I first logged into the game, I got pop-up notifications in the middle of the screen alerting me that I had unlocked a new reward for, no joke, 3 full minutes. For much of my playthrough, there was this window open in the corner of the screen filled with Chinese text. And the game is meant to be a looter shooter where you do missions large and small, gradually obtaining skill points, more powerful guns, and more protective gloves. Virtually every element of the game is designed to point you towards this style of play. But if you can look past that, past the minimap and objective markers and walkie-talkie calls from your AI allies, there is an eerie sort of magic in these digital streets too. The detail and the density is staggering. Unlike 15 years prior in Max Payne, every block is just smashed full of cars and newspaper boxes, barricades and trash bags. The city stretches out in every direction, skyscrapers forming the walls of artificial canyons. The snow on the street isn't pristine, it's filthy and pockmarked with footsteps, tire treads, and garbage. Especially at night, with spotlights creating islands of illumination along the darkened avenues, The Division is startling in its fidelity. I chose to ignore the flashing objectives and waypoints and simply wander out into Manhattan, wondering how far the game would let me go. And apart from the multiplayer quarantine zone in the center of the map, there are no limits on how far a player can stray. I walked further and further into the city, feeling not like an awakened sleeper agent, but a shell-shocked resident needing to see with my own eyes what had happened to my home. If you look up at night, past the lightless windows of the borough's glass towers, you will see the most unfamiliar sight of all: stars glittering above the city that used to never sleep. Unlike the compressed city as a world map in Parasite Eve, however, The Division's attempt at photorealism also highlights the limits of its simulation. Although some buildings are reproduced practically one-to-one, others are noticeably wrong. The Empire State Building and Chrysler Buildings, icons of the city, even featured in the game's own cover art, are nowhere to be found. In their place are uncanny mutations, like someone tried to draw them from memory. It's not due to artistic incompetence, however. Buildings can be, and often are, copyrighted. Their absence in The Division paints the city in a different light, every street recontextualized as a contract dispute. There are, apparently, limits to how realistic a digital city can be. The game, set in 2015, obviously does not include the Twin Towers, but the Freedom Tower, the One World Trade Center, their replacement, is also missing. Our historical memory is built through art and technology, cave paintings and Roman aqueducts, stories and sculpture. Games are now a part of that lineage. In some ways, they are a quantum leap forward. You can walk through a picture of a time in a once unimaginable way, but there is no perfect reproduction here. Each is bound to its own artistic idea and its own technological moment, each a unique and limited version of a city that means 10 million different things to 10 million different people. Just earlier this year, a YouTuber named Daniel Karpenko uploaded a video compilation of the Twin Towers in 176 different video games, beginning all the way back in 1983 with New York City for Atari. The montage is hypnotic, flashing unceasingly through the years, the city and the towers used as backdrops for racing games, flight simulators, beat-em-ups, shoot-em-ups, point-and-clicks, pinball sims, and yes, Parasite Eve and Max Payne. And then, after 2001, nothing. For 5 years. As if the memory itself was untouchable, that we couldn't bear to replicate it. Not until, if Karpenko's video is to be believed, Driver Parallel Lines, a 2006 game set in 1976, did the Trade Center once again loom on the skyline. A consciously different choice than all the games that had come before it, used not as an imitation, but as a historical artifact, deciding to include something that was no longer there. Last year, Lionel Marsden, the developer of the VR game The Utility Room, released his sophomore effort, The Time Machine. In the opening of The Time Machine, you wander from a nondescript back alley into a wallpapered single room with a single lever. This is where the rest of the game will take place. The entire gameplay of The Time Machine consists of pulling this lever, waiting for a random date to spin into place, and then gazing out at that date through the machine's open doors. You cannot leave the time machine, nor exercise any control over the date you'll be traveling to. Often, the game's dates have some ironic or ominous significance to them. One of my first trips took me to some vast red plain on November 2nd, 1932. Apparently, this was the first day in Australia's Emu War, in which World War I veterans attempted to kill all the emus, ruining local farmers' crops. Other dates require less decoding. I laughed out loud on May 1st, 2003, when the doors opened on a slot canyon and a dismembered arm, aka what Aaron Ralston, the 127 Hours guy, left behind. The conceit of the game, at least in its first half or so, is the conflict between the notoriety of these dates and the placidity of their environments. While we might be looking at the day a war ended, a millennium started, or, I don't know, the Unabomber's cabin, most days, in most places, are just this. Not action-filled, not a climax, just an undisturbed moment in time. In real life, too, if you were in a randomly traveling time machine, you would most often not know where or what you were looking at. This is precisely how our memory does not work. No context, no movement, just a window opening onto another place. Eventually, though, the game has to do it. After a deeply frightening day in 1986 when the time machine's doors open directly onto Chernobyl's elephant's foot, the clock spins and spins, and eventually lands on the one inevitability in this story, September 11th, 2001. You wince and prepare yourself, and then the doors open on the towers and the island, bright and beautiful and hazy in the morning sun. And you can hear the bustle of the city below, and you can see the future in your mind's eye, and you know how temporary all of this is. But for now, here is the city, frozen in time, a map in a video game that will last as long as the hard drives that host it. And then the doors close, and the machine moves on.